Have you ever watched someone get humiliated so completely, so publicly, that the whole room went silent, and then watched that same person pull out a phone, make one call, and walk away while the person who humiliated them stood there shaking? I have, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. The Hargrove Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was the hotel, the kind of place where a single night in the executive suite cost more than most people's monthly rent. 22 floors of marble and gold-plated fixtures rising above downtown Atlanta. A rooftop bar that made the cover of Travel Plus Leisure 3 years running. A lobby so quiet and so clean you felt like you were being evaluated the moment you walked through the revolving doors. And that lobby, that spotless, hushed, perfectly curated lobby, is where everything began to fall apart on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Jonah Kwame Asante was 26 years old, black, lean, maybe 5'10", with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that looked younger than his years. The kind of face that made people underestimate him constantly, and one he had long since stopped trying to correct. He was wearing what he always wore when he traveled for work: dark joggers, a plain gray hoodie, worn New Balance sneakers, a canvas backpack over one shoulder, no jewelry, no watch. Nothing that would tell you, looking at him from across a lobby, that Jonah Kwame Asante had just turned down a job offer from Google, because he'd already built something bigger. He walked in through the revolving door at 2:47 p.m. and stopped for exactly 3 seconds to check his phone. He had a 4 o'clock meeting on the 14th floor. He was early, as always. He crossed the lobby toward the front desk, intending to ask if his contact had already checked in, and that's when Reginald Moss stepped in front of him. Reginald Moss was 44 years old, white with the barrel chest, and slightly flushed complexion of a man who'd played college football and spent the next 20 years behind a desk. He'd been the guest services director at the Hargrove Grand for 11 years. He was proud of that. He wore his hotel badge like a medal, and he spoke to guests with a warmth that evaporated the moment he decided. In that private, practiced, completely automatic way some men have, that you weren't the kind of guest who mattered. He looked at Jonah for about 1 second. "Can I help you find something?" Reginald said. "Not welcome. Not good afternoon." The tone wasn't even hostile, exactly. It was the tone you use when you're speaking to someone who you suspect has wandered in from somewhere else. Jonah looked up from his phone. "I'm good, thanks. Are you checking in?" "No, are you meeting someone?" Jonah paused. "I have an appointment." Reginald's eyes moved over Jonah slowly. The hoodie, the backpack, the sneakers. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a sneer. More like a conclusion being reached. In the hotel, on 14. Reginald tilted his head slightly. And who would that be with? Jonah looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was completely flat. "That's a private matter." The lobby was not crowded, but it was not empty. 3 guests sat in the cluster of low chairs near the fountain. 2 bellmen stood near the entrance. A woman at the front desk had stopped typing. Everyone, in that particular way people do when something uncomfortable is happening in a quiet space, had gone very still. Reginald Moss smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Sir, this is a private hotel. If you don't have a reservation and you can't tell me who you're here to see, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside." Jonah said nothing. "I'm sure you understand," Reginald added. The way he said understand, the pause before it, the slight drop in volume, made it clear that he didn't think Jonah would understand at all. Jonah looked at him for another beat. Then he looked past him toward the elevator bank. Then he looked back. "All right," Jonah said quietly, and he took a step forward. Reginald moved to block him. Not grabbing, just moving, positioning himself in the way. A physical statement. "Not past me." The 2 bellmen near the door looked at each other. The woman at the front desk, her name was Claudette Pinheiro, 31, Afro-Latina, had worked the desk for 4 years and had watched Reginald do variations of this before. Opened her mouth and then closed it again. She knew how this went. She'd tried before. "Sir," Reginald's voice had dropped to something harder. "I asked you to wait outside." Jonah didn't raise his voice. didn't shift his posture, didn't do any of the things you do when someone is pushing you toward an edge. He simply looked at Reginald Moss with the steady, unhurried expression of someone doing a calculation. "You don't want to do this," Jonah said. 3 words, perfectly even. Not a threat. Something else, almost a courtesy. Like a warning light you notice a second before the car in front of you brakes. Reginald heard it as an insult. He heard it as an accusation. He heard it the way men like Reginald Moss always hear calm from people they've already decided don't belong, as arrogance, as defiance, as something that needed to be corrected. "I'm going to call security," Reginald said. "Okay," said Jonah, and he sat down. Not outside. Not in some waiting area near the door. He walked to the cluster of chairs near the fountain, the nice chairs, the ones arranged around the marble table with the fresh orchid centerpiece, and he sat down, put his backpack on the chair beside him, and took out his phone. Reginald Moss stood very still for a moment. Then he turned, walked to the front desk, and made a call. What Reginald Moss did not know, what almost no one at the Hargrove Grand knew, because these things are rarely announced, was that the Hargrove Grand was in trouble. Not immediately visible trouble. The lobby was still marble. The rooftop bar was still full on weekends. But the ownership group that had run the hotel for the last 9 years had made a series of decisions in the past 18 months that had quietly, steadily, brought them to the edge of something they did not have the resources to come back from. A failed expansion into Nashville. A renovation of the restaurant that had gone 40% over budget. A management contract dispute that was still grinding through mediation. The numbers, if you knew where to look, were not good. The Alderton Group knew where to look. The Alderton Group was a private investment firm based in Atlanta, and over the past 3 years, they had quietly become one of the most aggressive buyers of distressed luxury hospitality assets in the Southeast. They were careful, they were thorough, and when they found a target, they sent someone in first. Someone who could walk the property without being recognized, without being announced, someone who would see what the hotel actually was rather than what it showed a prospective buyer it wanted to be. That person was always Jonah. Jonah Kwame Asante held no official title at the Alderton Group that you'd find on a business card. He was not a consultant or an analyst or a VP of anything. What he was at 26 was the person that Miriam Alderton, founder, majority shareholder, 61 years old, with a record of buying distressed assets and turning them into landmarks, trusted more than anyone else to tell her the truth about a property. He'd found the Nashville deal 3 months before it collapsed. He'd seen the warning signs in the restaurant renovation before the overruns hit. His read on a property wasn't just financial, it was human. He walked through lobbies and watched how staff treated strangers. He sat in restaurants and noticed which tables got filled first. He stood in hallways and listened. And what he was doing in the lobby of the Hargrove Grand on a Tuesday afternoon in April was his job. The 4 o'clock meeting on 14 was with the ownership group's lead attorney. Not a negotiation, a final review. The numbers had been verified. The structure was set. The Alderton Group was prepared to offer $340 million for the Hargrove Grand, the attached parking structure, and the operational management contract. All that remained was to sign. Jonah had arrived 40 minutes early because he wanted time in the lobby. He wanted to feel the place before he sat down in a conference room and committed $340 million of his employer's capital to it. He'd been in the lobby for approximately 4 minutes when Reginald Moss stepped in front of him. The security guard who arrived was a young man named Derek, who had the look of someone who did not want to be involved in whatever this was. He stood near the chairs and glanced between Jonah and Reginald, and the 3 guests near the fountain who were no longer pretending not to watch. "Sir," Derek said, addressing Jonah with a visible discomfort that Reginald missed entirely. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Jonah said. He was looking at his phone. "He doesn't have a reservation or a verified appointment," Reginald said from behind Derek. "I've asked him twice to wait outside." Derek looked at Jonah. "Sir, if you could just..." It's 3:18, Jonah said, still looking at his phone. My meeting is at 4. I have 42 minutes. He glanced up. I'll wait here. Derek took a breath. And then Reginald Moss did the thing. Later, people would struggle to explain what possessed him. The most honest answer was probably the simplest one. He had done versions of this before, and nothing bad had ever happened. Hotels like this, lobbies like this. He had always been able to move people like Jonah Asante without consequence, because people like Jonah Asante were supposed to leave, were supposed to defer, were supposed to make it easy. And when this one didn't, when this one just sat there and looked at his phone with that quiet, unbothered expression, something in Reginald Moss snapped. He reached out, grabbed the canvas backpack off the chair beside Jonah, and said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "You need to take your things and go." Jonah looked at his backpack in Reginald's hand. He looked at Reginald's face. He stood up, and the lobby went completely silent. "Give me my bag," Jonah said. His voice was so quiet that Reginald almost had to lean in to hear it. That was the thing about Jonah's anger. When it finally arrived, it didn't get louder. It got smaller, compressed, like something being pressurized in a very small space. "I will give it to you," Reginald said. "Outside." "You grabbed my personal property," Jonah said. Still quiet, still even, in front of witnesses. "Give it back." One of the guests near the fountain, a woman in her 50s, white, clearly a long-time hotel guest based on how comfortable she looked, said quietly, firmly, "Give him his bag." Claudette Pinheiro at the front desk had her hand flat on the desk. She was not moving. Her face was very carefully blank. Reginald looked at the woman by the fountain. He looked at Claudette. He looked at Derek, who had taken a very deliberate half-step backward. And Reginald Moss, who had spent 11 years learning exactly who mattered in a lobby like this, handed Jonah his backpack. Jonah took it. He sat back down. He took out his phone, opened his contacts, and made a call. It was 3:21 p.m. when Jonah called the 14th floor. The person who picked up was a woman named Harriet Voss Drummond, 53 years old, white, the kind of corporate attorney who had seen enough in 28 years of practice that almost nothing surprised her anymore. She was sitting in the hotel's private conference room with two members of the Hargrove Ownership Group's legal team, a stack of documents and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Jonah," she said. "I'm in the lobby," Jonah said. A pause. "Are you on your way up?" "Not yet." Another pause. "You might want to hear this first." He described what had happened. Quietly, without drama. Just the facts in order, with the precision of someone who had been trained his whole life to observe carefully and report accurately. Harriet Voss Drummond listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You have it on the security footage?" "The hotel has it on the security footage," Jonah said, "which is technically their footage. But I also have two witnesses who sat 8 feet away." A longer pause. "Come up," Harriet said. "Don't sign anything." The meeting on the 14th floor lasted approximately 20 minutes. Harriet Voss Drummond had been in that room for 3 hours going through the final terms. She had brought the contract. She had been up until 3:21 p.m., fully prepared to close. When Jonah walked in and sat down across from the two attorneys for the ownership group, there was a moment where everyone could see, just from looking at him, that something had changed. He didn't look angry. He didn't look upset. He looked the way he always has looked, calm, slightly tired, present. He said, "I need to tell you what happened in your lobby 40 minutes ago," he told them. One of the ownership group's attorneys, a man named Pruitt, whose face went through several stages over the course of the next 60 seconds, started to say something about misunderstandings, about the pressures of managing a busy property, about how an isolated incident. Jonah held up one finger, not rudely, just one finger. A pause. "I'm not here to negotiate this," he said. "I'm telling you what I observed. And what I observed tells me something about how this property operates when it thinks no one important is watching." He let that sit for a moment, which is exactly when it matters. Pruitt opened his mouth again. "The offer," Jonah said quietly, "is being restructured. The room went still. Miriam is going to want a full operational audit before we move forward. HR records for the guest services team. Any previous complaints, formal or informal, related to guest treatment. We'll want the last 2 years. He paused. The number changes. The timeline changes. Whether we proceed at all, that's a conversation for tomorrow. Pruitt looked at the other attorney. The other attorney looked at his hands. For a $340 million deal, Pruitt said carefully. You're telling me one incident in the lobby. I'm telling you, Jonah said, that I walked into your lobby at 2:47 in the afternoon wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a backpack, and your guest services director tried to have me removed 3 separate times, grabbed my bag, and called security, before I had said a single inappropriate word or taken a single inappropriate action. He folded his hands on the table. If that's how this property treats strangers in the afternoon, I need to understand what else it does that we haven't seen. The silence in that room was the loudest thing that had happened all day. Downstairs in the lobby, Reginald Moss was in the middle of a conversation with his assistant manager, a woman named Tracy who had the expression of someone who had been trying to tell someone something for a very long time when his phone buzzed. It was his general manager. The message said, "My office, now." Reginald had been in that general manager's office before, and it had always gone fine. He had been doing this job for 11 years, and he knew how to explain a situation. He walked into the office at 3:44 p.m. The general manager, a compact, quiet man named Arthur Beauchamp, who ran the Hargrove Grand the way a watchmaker runs a shop, precisely, without unnecessary noise, looked up from his desk and said, "Close the door." Reginald closed the door. "Tell me about the man in the lobby," Arthur said, and Reginald told him. The same version he'd been constructing in his head since 3:21. The loitering, the refusal to identify himself, the potential liability, the security protocol. He made it sound like a decision, a professional judgment. Arthur listened to all of it. Then he turned his computer monitor around so Reginald could see it. The security footage was already pulled up. The timestamp read 14:47:23. The angle was wide. From the corner above the front desk, you could see everything. Reginald watched himself step in front of Jonah, watched himself block the path to the elevator, watched himself reach out and take the backpack off the chair. He watched his own face. Arthur let it play for about 45 seconds. Then he turned the monitor back. "The man you removed from the lobby," Arthur said, "is the primary assessment officer for the Alderton Group. Do you know who the Alderton Group is?" Reginald said nothing. They were 48 hours from signing a $340 million acquisition. Arthur's voice had not changed pitch once since Reginald walked in. That steadiness was somehow worse than shouting. He came in early, to observe. That's his job. He walks properties before they close to assess operational culture. A pause. You gave him something to assess. The clock on the wall ticked. "I'm going to need your badge," Arthur said. Reginald's mouth opened. "And I'm going to need your access card, your parking pass, and your office key." Arthur stood up. "HR will be in contact regarding the terms of your separation. You should speak to an attorney before you sign anything they send you." Arthur. Reginald. Arthur's voice, for the first time, shifted. Just slightly. Not softer. Something else. Tired, maybe. "You've worked here for 11 years. And for 11 years I've heard complaints that I did not do enough with. That's on me as much as it's on you." He picked up the phone on his desk. "This conversation is over." Jonah was in the elevator to 14 when his phone buzzed with a text from Harriet. "They want to talk about remediation. What do you want me to say?" He thought about it for 3 floors. Then he typed back, "Full audit, HR records, 2 years of guest complaints. Nothing off the table until we see everything." Then, after a moment, "And make sure Claudette Pinheiro at the front desk isn't caught up in whatever happens next. She didn't do anything wrong." Harriet's response came back in 4 seconds. "Already noted." The Alderton Group did not walk away from the Hargrove Grand. Miriam Alderton, when Jonah briefed her by phone that evening from his hotel room, a different hotel. He'd booked elsewhere for the night, listened to the whole story without speaking. When he finished, she said, "What do you think we should do?" He said, "Buy it, but do the audit. The bones are good. The problem is the culture, and culture is fixable if you actually fix it." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "You sure?" "The lobby is beautiful," Jonah said. "The orchids are real." The woman at the front desk watched all of that happen, and she looked like she'd been trying to stop it for years. He looked at the ceiling. "That tells me something too." The deal closed 6 weeks later, restructured at $318 million, with a full operational audit built into the first-year terms and a new guest services training protocol that Jonah helped design. Claudette Pinheiro was promoted to front desk supervisor 18 months later. The rooftop bar remained excellent. Reginald Moss, for his part, never worked in hotel management again. Not because no one would hire him. That happened too, eventually, but because it took him 2 years to understand why. 2 years of telling the story the way he'd told it in the general manager's office, with the loitering and the protocol and the reasonable professional judgment. 2 years before he watched the security footage again, alone on his laptop, and finally saw what Arthur Beauchamp had seen. What his own face looked like, in real time, when he decided that the young man with the gray hoodie and the canvas backpack did not belong. Here's what I want you to sit with before you close out of this video. Jonah Asante never raised his voice, never made a scene, never pulled out a business card or dropped a number or said a single word designed to make Reginald Moss feel small. He just sat down in that chair and made a phone call. That's the part that gets me every time I think about this story. Because how many times have you been in a room or a lobby or a store or a job interview where someone looked at you and decided in about 1 second who you were, and how much energy have you spent over the years trying to correct that, trying to prove something, trying to be louder or dressier or more credentialed or more legible to people who already made up their minds? Jonah didn't do any of that. He sat down, he called the people he was there to meet, he did his job, and the consequences arrived without him having to carry them. That's not just a great story. That's something worth remembering the next time someone looks at you and sees something smaller than what you are. If this story hit you, if you've ever been Jonah in that lobby, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you watched from. Tell me if you've lived a version of this. I read every single one. Like this video if you want to see more stories like it. Subscribe to Glen Stories if you're new here. We tell real, human stories about power, dignity, and what happens when the world underestimates the wrong person. And I'll see you in the next one.